The Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Pacific Oceans encircle the second largest nation in the world, Canada, which is situated on the North American continent directly above the United States. Around 8,891 kilometers or 5,525 miles long, the border between Canada and the US is the longest border between any two nations in the world. The geography of Canada is even more interesting because 80% of the country's population lives just 100 miles from the US border. In fact, 50% of all Canadians reside just south of it. Ontario, a Canadian province, is responsible for 38% of the country's GDP. Most people want to reside in places with a variety of economic opportunities. Real estate, mining, and manufacturing are Canada's three main industries, and they are largely concentrated in these provinces. The outlined colored circle depicts the province-by-province percentage change in Canadian home prices over the previous 10 years. Canadian housing costs have risen since the financial crisis. The consumer spending boom is fueling the housing boom. Canadians were urged to take on debt to purchase homes in 2009 by the government stimulus program to boost the economy and the central bank's interest rate of close to 1%. People purchase because they anticipate or fear an increase in pricing. Rising interest rates over the past year have temporarily lowered property costs, but the majority of Canadian renters still believe that owning a home may be out of reach. 63% of Canadians who don't own a home have given up on ever buying one, according to the findings of an Ipsos poll. In recent years, the demand for rental housing has been significantly influenced by immigration, according to a research by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC. Since many immigrants to Canada choose to rent rather than buy their first house, demand for rental housing is kept high. Not only does Canada have high housing costs, but so do the majority of wealthy nations, including the US and UK, where rents seem to be reasonable. The customers in the Canadian housing market are an anomaly since they may be at the limit of their borrowing and spending power. Compared to corporations, Canadians spend a larger percentage of investment capital on housing. In this example, business investment consists of non-residential buildings, machinery and equipment, and intellectual property, which combined only account for 9.3% of GDP. On the other hand, a significant increase in home investment drove up Canada's net stock of residential assets by 18.9%, accounting for 22.0% of the country's wealth. In Canada, a sizable portion of the population would prefer invest in a home than a business. Who is to blame for them? Up until you start to wonder where the employment come from if there is no local investment, it sounds like a terrific strategy. Business investment is essential for promoting economic growth in the economy. Long-term business investment boosts the economy's overall capacity for production by creating a larger physical capital stock, which enables more goods and services to be produced with the same amount of labor and other resources. Canada really spends less in business as a percentage of GDP than the US does. Both domestic and foreign individuals invest in business. Foreign direct investment, primarily from the US, fills Canada's lower level of domestic investment. In actuality, Canadian businesses rarely wow the globe. According to a survey of 900 executives, Canadians are less risk-taking than their relatives south of the border. It is no longer acceptable that the top Canadian company, Brookfield Asset Management, a finance manager, is ranked only 158th on Fortune's list of the world's largest companies, while 6 of the 10 largest companies in the world by revenue are American or Chinese. The US has an impact on some of Canada's economy's distinctive features or attributes. Canada has established its economic practices in reaction to the impact of its southern neighbor because of its proximity to and close commercial ties with the United States. For instance, American businesses have operations in Canada primarily to avoid tariffs or taxes, yet headquarters and intellectual property frequently remain in the United States. Canadian startups are being purchased by foreign corporations, particularly American ones, in large numbers. This is partially due to the fact that small Canadian businesses forfeit tax advantages when they go public by selling shares on the stock market. As a result, these businesses are more susceptible to acquisition by bigger international companies. Due to all of this, the economy is now less inventive and productive than America's. To put the disparity in perspective, Americans make about $80,000 annually compared to Canadians' average of $60,000. In other words, wages rise by approximately 33% on average by traveling just a few hours south. About 3.5% more hours are worked by Americans than by Canadians. The average American employee generates $74 worth of value every hour, compared to the average Canadian employee's $57 worth. What makes Americans work not just harder but also more intelligently than Canadians? Therefore, what causes the gap? The most important variable is the significant variation in the amount per worker that is spent or invested in equipment, tools, innovation, and capital, or what economists refer to as capital intensity. Canadian businesses invested around $13,000 per employee in capital, compared to $20,500 for US businesses. Among the G7 nations, Canada too made very little investment in R&D. The World Intellectual Property Organization estimates that the US creates about twice as many patents per person than Canada. An increase in productivity is directly correlated with higher living standards or income per person. When adjusted for purchasing power parity, Canada's per-person income in 2022 was $57,800, over $17,400 less than the US. Since Canadians at the bottom of the income spectrum are better off than Americans in their position due to lower levels of inequality, this gap has not yet been a significant issue. The income disparities in any nation are evaluated using a statistic called the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a measure of equality that spans from 0 to 1, with 1 denoting perfect inequality. The Canadian Gini coefficient has never surpassed that of the United States over the past 42 years. In fact, during the course of those 42 years, inequality in the US has increased more quickly than it has in Canada. In Canada, income inequality has been relatively stable over the past 10 years and decreased after 2010, after rising dramatically during the challenging early to mid-1990s period. However, in comparison to other developed economies, the Canadian economy continues to be less competitive. The IMD World Competitiveness Ranking places Canada as the 14th most competitive nation out of 63, which is a decline from previous years dating back to 1997. Aggressive free market nations like Singapore, ranked 3rd, and the US, ranked 10th, as well as progressive nations like Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden, which are known for their robust labor rights and high wages, are currently outperforming the nation. A competitiveness index is more of a productivity indicator than a direct indicator of how competitive a nation is with other nations. Despite the fact that competition is typically considered as a catalyst for innovation, efficiency, and economic expansion, Canada was very inventive about 10 to 15 years ago, despite fierce rivalry from bigger and better funded rivals. Canada needs to be more imaginative and creative in order to remain competitive, and it can do so since it has some of the most bright and highly skilled people in the world. This is supported by the IMD research, which reveals that when it comes to talent, Canada is ranked 11th in the globe. But if you don't use your talent for your country, what's the point? Everyone with talent is moving south of the border, where they can earn more money. The phenomenon is referred to as brain drain. Comparatively to several other nations, Canada has historically had fewer government measures to support researchers or business. It is a truth that Canada's reliance on natural resources has deterred investment in other industries like manufacturing, research, and business ventures. Canada has historically had a resource-based economy. Mining, timber, oil, and natural gas are its main economic sectors. Natural resources made up 51% of the value of all Canadian merchandise exports in 2021 and directly or indirectly accounted for 17% of nominal GDP. However, the two largest exports from Canada, oil and automobiles, are both in decline and might stay that way. The United States, which is by far the largest foreign consumer for oil from Alberta's tar sands, is generating more of its own oil than it is importing. The auto industry never fully recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. From a peak of 3 million vehicles in 1999 to 1.4 million in 2020, production has decreased. That only leaves the booming services sector for future growth. The financial services, real estate, and communications sectors have all experienced substantial growth in recent years. With one of the biggest concentrations of financial services business headquarters in the Americas, Toronto has emerged as a new financial center in North America. Furthermore, Canada's financial sector, one of the safest in the world, leads the G7 for the 11th consecutive year. Despite widespread skepticism, Canada fared better than the United States in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, thanks in part to its conservative, tightly regulated, and unaffected by intense competition, banks. Canada continues to have one of the strongest economies in the world despite all of its economic issues. Its citizens are courteous and self-assured, its government is democratic and stable, its business climate is favorable, and it is regarded as one of the least corrupt nations in the world. However, growth hasn't been as robust as in other advanced economies for a while, and the OECD forecasts that it won't get better anytime soon.